I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
Welcome back, everyone. It's the President's Guy, your Commander-in-Chief of Presidential History, and we have another reaction today, this one from the channel History Buff Hub. Fairly new channel from what I understand, and this one's about the 10 worst second-term presidents in history. Now, before we get into this, I'm curious as to how he's going to lay out what he defines as second-term president. Is he going to limit this to presidents who were elected to 2 consecutive terms? Or is this going to be a person who served more than 1 full term? And what I mean by that is, for example, Teddy Roosevelt took over the end of McKinley's term and then ran for a re-election. So he had more than 1 term, but he was not elected himself to 2 terms, like someone like Richard Nixon, who was elected in 68 and then elected again in 72. Because we haven't actually had that many presidents be re-elected. In terms of serving 2 full consecutive terms, we've only really had like 14 presidents do it, and only twice have we had it be 3 back-to-back. We had Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. Then we had Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. So that's only happened twice. So we'll see. I expect to see, obviously we've got Nixon on here. I expect to see LBJ. Perhaps we'll see maybe one of the founding fathers, perhaps. Probably going to see maybe Clinton from the Lewinsky scandal. So let's just get into it and we'll see who he thinks are the 10 worst second-term presidents.
It's known as the second-term curse. U.S. presidents historically suffer much worse second terms than first terms, particularly since the end of the Civil War. But just how bad can they get? Welcome to History Buffs Hub. In this video, we're going to take a look at the 10 worst second terms in presidential history. Before we get started, please hit that like and subscribe button down below.
It's an interesting animation.
Also, ring the bell and turn on your notifications. There are several criteria for the list of worst second terms in history. First is everything that entails the job of the president. Did they have any major legislative defeats? What was the impact of their executive orders? Was their foreign policy objective a success? How was their leadership and response in a time of crisis? Second is personal. Were there any scandals that clouded their second term? Have any personal tragedies? And third is popularity. We'll do this one in 2 ways, looking at their approval ratings and looking at the electoral success of their own party. This has nothing to do with whether or not I or anybody else thinks they actually did a good job in their second term, but whether or not their second term went the way they would have wanted it to go and whether or not they accomplished any of their goals for the second term. Now let's dive in.
And it's interesting that he starts this list when Johnson talks about the party, because when Johnson, obviously he doesn't run in 68, but when he probably would have lost pretty soundly if he did. When Humphrey loses to Nixon, it wasn't an indictment of the Democrats so much as Johnson, because the Democrats actually gained seats in Congress in that election. So it wasn't an indictment of the Democratic Party's handling of things, primarily civil rights in Vietnam. It was more of blaming LBJ, which is, again, is not fair, because Congress is just as responsible for things getting done as the president, but the president's the poster boy, the front man, so to speak, of the policy.
Number 10, Lyndon B. Johnson. Ascending to the presidency with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, LBJ was elected in 1964 over Barry Goldwater with the largest share of the popular vote since before there were actually 2 viable parties in America. But his second...
And I have a video about this, and I'll attach it in the corner. But this happened a lot during the 20th century. FDR claims the most massive electoral victory. I think he actually does it twice in his 4 terms. And then Johnson does it, and then Nixon does it, and then Reagan does it, just sweeping essentially the entire country.
Second term was marred by his escalation of the Vietnam War. While the U.S. was already there as part of its policy of containment in the Cold War, a series of unfortunate events that included the assassination of the South Vietnamese president 3 weeks before LBJ became president plunged the area into chaos. Fearing the political backlash over losing a war, Johnson lied about North Vietnamese attacks on U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964.
That's not true. Sean Monger has a very, very good video about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And just to briefly surmise, or to summarize, the USS Maddox, which was the ship that was involved, was attacked by a North Vietnamese gunboat. Now, that gunboat was not acting under direct orders from the Vietnamese government, and the Vietnamese have documentation about this incident. This boat was a military boat, but was not told to do this, but it did attack the Maddox. In the Gulf of Tonkin, there's kind of a weather phenomenon that affects radar. So a couple days later, the Maddox was, I don't know if it was the Maddox, perhaps it was another ship, but either the Maddox or another Navy vessel saw something on the radar and thought they were under attack again after what had just happened. So they kind of fired into the distance and nothing happened. By the time the Secretary of Defense gets the report, he knows that the Maddox incident did happen. The second one was not an actual attack. The intelligence he gives to Johnson says that both were an attack. Now, this leads to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which Johnson does not even implement until after the following election. The Gulf of Tonkin incident happens in like August of 64, or that's when the resolution passes, shortly after the incident. It's not until past January of 65 that he even uses this newfound authority to escalate the war. So this kind of goes back to the JFK conspiracy nonsense, but just to briefly summarize, that's what the Tonkin incident was. It was not a false flag.
As a pretext for dramatically increasing troops in the region in 1965, and with that came a dramatic increase in the draft. Americans were forced to deal with daily stories of troops coming home dead or wounded, live video footage showing the horrors of the war, a first for that time, and the constant fear that either they or one of their loved ones would get drafted.
I have to look this up, but I'm fairly certain the draft wasn't enacted until 1969 or 1970. I might be wrong there, but I'm fairly certain that's the case.
Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today became a chant among anti-war protesters. There was also a dramatic rise in crime rates during this period, which led Johnson to declare war on crime, setting the early stages for what would become the war on drugs. The war on crime and Vietnam War fractured LBJ's base and led to the rise of the New Left, a coalition of young people who were anti-war and supported the counterculture movement. Johnson had already lost the traditional Southern bloc of the Democratic Party with his passage of the Civil Rights Act. His goodwill with minority communities also fell apart thanks to Martin Luther King Jr. and Cesar Chavez openly opposing the war, the FBI's open hostility to the civil rights movement, and the arrest of people like Muhammad Ali for evading the draft. The assassinations of Malcolm X and MLK only added to the chaos. After nearly losing the New Hampshire primary, LBJ chose not to be the Democratic nominee in 1968, but that only created more chaos for his party.
What is this animation?
Popular Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in June of that year.
And this is kind of my historical hot take, but Kennedy wasn't going to win the election even if he won the primary. They were viewed just as establishment as Johnson, if not more at that point, by the New Left.
The riots and protests at the '68 Democratic Convention in Chicago ended with LBJ's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, getting the nomination, but he lost the election to Richard Nixon. After LBJ's presidency, Republicans held the White House for 20 of the next 24 years. The fracturing of the Democratic Party and Vietnam disaster would seem like reasons for LBJ to be higher on this list, but he had far too many significant legislative accomplishments in his second term for that to be the case, including the Voting Rights Act, passage of Medicare and Medicaid, Higher Education Act, Clean Air and Water Acts, and Fair Housing Act. Those all still have a major impact on American life to this day.
And people on the right always like to shit on the Great Society programs. They were all, for the most part, pretty damn phenomenal. Unlike the New Deal, where a lot of us kind of just throwing, things at the wall and seeing what stuck, the Great Society was much more targeted and strategic and specific with its goals. I mean, look at it, we still have Medicare and Medicaid to this day. The Clean Water and Clean Air Acts are still very prolific in keeping the environment clean. The Voting Rights Act, despite the best efforts of the current Congress and Supreme Court, was a major piece of legislation in actually enforcing the 14th Amendment. So LBJ is perhaps the most legislatively successful president maybe ever, which is why he's on the wall.
Number 9, Thomas Jefferson. The second term curse largely avoided the founding fathers who were president, but they still had some problems. George Washington dealt with the Whiskey Rebellion and the rise of political parties, and James Monroe dealt with the growing debate over slavery and the split of the Democratic-Republican Party. But Thomas Jefferson's second term takes the cake. He had to deal with the trial of his former vice president, Aaron Burr. It was bad enough that Burr shot and killed one of America's founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton.
Not even one of the founding fathers, perhaps the most important one, even more so than Washington. Our modern economic system, our military, just like the idea of a central bank of the United States, like the Federal Reserve, all these things come from Hamilton. The country does not exist the way that it does today without Alexander Hamilton. I would really recommend to everyone that they read Ron Chernow book about Hamilton. It was the one that was used to get the play through, or it was the basis for the Hamilton play. Phenomenal book. Alexander Hamilton is incredibly underrated as a founding father, and a lot of that has to do with Thomas Jefferson, the Jeffersonian Democrats that followed after the Democratic-Republican Party, and all of the kind of rise of the states' rights movement. But Alexander Hamilton deserves his rightful place in history as perhaps the most important founding father.
But he was also arrested in 1807 and tried for treason.
What is this animation?
That he was involved in a plan to get the western states at that time in the Union to break off and form their own government. Adding insult to injury.
And would not be the first time that a vice president would try to do that. See John C. Calhoun during the nullification crisis.
Burr was acquitted after Jefferson himself ordered the prosecution. From a policy perspective, Jefferson was forced to uphold the United States' position of neutrality during the Napoleonic Wars, specifically the conflicts involving France and Britain, which was extremely difficult for him because of his personal connections to the French.
Jefferson loved the French. Even during the French Revolution, when he had friends in France who were telling him about the atrocities that were being committed once the revolution kind of quickly fell apart, he just refused to believe it. Even he was living there in the early years of the French Revolution. He helped Lafayette write the Declaration of Rights of Man. So he had a huge hard-on for the French.
To force those countries to respect American neutrality, Jefferson signed the Embargo Act of 1807 passed by Congress, banning trade with all foreign nations. It led to an economic disaster, and he was forced to repeal it
And the War of 1812 eventually.
There are some positives of Jefferson's second term, to be fair. He signed a bill banning the slave trade in 1808, but there is a legitimate argument that such a move resulted in slavery lasting even longer in the U.S. because of how valuable domestic slaves became overnight.
There's an argument to be said there, supply and demand. There was a clause in the Constitution, of course, written in 1788, that said the slave trade could not be banned for 20 years, and then Jefferson signs it. He actually tried to put a ban on slavery on the Northwest Ordinance for the territories above the 13 colonies in the early 1780s, and it didn't get passed. But the cotton gin is more instrumental in keeping the slave trade going, because now cotton is a less laborious crop to kind of separate, so it becomes much more important in the South, whereas other crops like tobacco and such were not. So that's perhaps more cause for that. And the slave trade still kept going. They kept importing illegal slaves all the way up until 1857, when the Wanderer, which was the last illegal import of slaves into the country, or really at all, arrived in Jekyll Island, Georgia in 1857.
You could say that it was still worth it, given how inhumane the slave trade itself was, but honestly, the slave trade didn't really end. Illegal importation of slaves into the U.S. was still common in many southern states afterward. Also, Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party maintained power over the Federalists, with James Madison winning by a landslide in the 1808 presidential election and keeping the party in control of Congress. So it wasn't all bad. Number 8, Abraham Lincoln. He got shot. Seriously, if you get assassinated...
That's an insanely stupid entry. I get what he's saying, but the term lasted all of a damn month. And even then, in that month, it was pretty successful, more than a lot of second-term presidents, or even, individual terms of presidents. The war ended, essentially. The Appomattox surrender happened, 3 days before Lincoln dies. I mean, if anything, Lincoln didn't have to deal with the problem of Reconstruction, which, only he really could have dealt with. Johnson certainly was no help. But that's just such a cheeky lame, low energy entry, a lot like these animations we keep seeing on the side.
In your second term, I'd say that's kind of a sucky term. The real question is, why wasn't he higher? Well, he had some rare successes during the 1 month of his second term. 6 days before he was killed, Robert E. Lee surrendered, effectively securing victory for the Union in the Civil War. Lincoln's political efforts had also ensured that the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery would pass, even if it wasn't ratified until nearly 8 months after his assassination. Given his personal tragedies that had already taken place and everything he had dealt with regarding the war, I can safely say I believe by 1865, Lincoln would willingly have given his life for those two things to happen. However, Lincoln's death also ascended Andrew Johnson to the presidency, arguably the worst president ever. Number 7.
Other than the current one, yes. In terms of doing things to destroy the country that were unfortunately legal, yeah, Johnson's the worst president of all time. No person has done more damage or attempted to do more damage and halting the progression, of a people than Andrew Johnson. You don't have the civil rights movement happening in the 1960s if Johnson had just gotten out of the damn way. That's not to say that there wouldn't have been conflicts in the South, but if Lincoln had seen his second term through and then we got to Grant, things would have been drastically different.
Ulysses S. Grant. Grant's second term was surrounded by scandals involving his cabinet members, starting with kickbacks from the Transcontinental Railroad that forced him to replace his vice president before his re-election.
Which wouldn't even be the last time he had to have a scandal involving his vice president.
He also had the whiskey ring scandal, in which whiskey distillers bribed government officials to evade taxes. By the end of his second term, his attorney general, along with his secretaries of war, navy, and interior, had all been accused of taking bribes. Grant's second term also included the Panic of 1873, the first global depression in the industrial age. His peace policy with Native Americans was in direct contrast to his encouragement of frontier settlements as well, resulting in numerous violent clashes with Native American communities, most notably the Battle of Little Bighorn in the Great Sioux Wars of 1876, which is famous for General Custer's last stand.
Custer picked that fight. He deserved what he got. Grant was as magnanimous as a 19th century president could be towards the Native Americans. He restrained Sherman a lot from just going out and committing genocide. That doesn't excuse anything that happened, but Grant was not directing the full-scale slaughter of Native Americans. With that said, the Great Depression, as the Panic of 1873 was called at that point, was bad, and he vetoed a bill that probably wouldn't have really helped. Probably would have spiked inflation a lot. It basically would have just been the kind of what we saw like during COVID, where they were kind of just sending money to people. But back then, we were still on the gold standard, and Grant had actually spent his first term paying down a lot of the debt and kind of getting the greenbacks back out of circulation, which was the paper money, which back then was really just a promise to pay you in gold. So a lot of things are going on in Grant's term that are out of his control per se. He was very naive and trusting of people, and there was a lot of corruption in his cabinet that he was absolutely not involved in. Ron Chernow's book on Grant is phenomenal. I would recommend it. Probably the best single-volume biography I've ever read. But because he is the president, because he's in charge of these people, he gets a lot of the blame for it. It still speaks to his popularity that he almost won a third term.
The constant violence in the South led to the public souring on Grant's Reconstruction efforts. All of this resulted in the Republican Party getting destroyed in the 1874 midterms, losing over 90 seats in the House to surrender control of the chamber for the first time in 14 years. They did technically hold the presidency in 1876, with Rutherford B. Hayes beating Samuel J. Tilden, but Tilden won the popular vote, and the race ended in an electoral college tie, which sent it back to Congress. Hayes was only given the tiebreaker after an informal agreement by the Republicans to withdraw from the South, so while Grant's party held on to power, he had to give up on Reconstruction in the process. Number 6.
Can't really argue with that.
Cleveland. The first Democrat-elected president in the post-Civil War era, Cleveland was...
Now, it's interesting to suggest that he was one of the worst second-term presidents because he came back. Like Trump just did, Cleveland, although winning the popular vote, lost, what was it, the 1888 election to Benjamin Harrison, then comes back in 1892, so he was the 22nd and 24th president. So that in and of itself is impressive because it was unprecedented to that point and was unprecedented after it for 130 years. So that speaks a lot.
First elected in 1884, ending the Republicans' sixth presidential election winning streak dating back to 1860, still a record for a single party. He lost the White House to Republican Benjamin Harrison in 1888, but returned to win it back in 1892, the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms until Donald Trump. Cleveland's second term was a disaster.
What is this animation?
The Panic of 1893 began 2 months before his inauguration and became the worst economic catastrophe in U.S. history until the Great Depression. Although Cleveland couldn't be blamed for the panic, fair or not, he was blamed for the fact that the conditions didn't improve during his presidency. In terms of legislative success, he did repeal the Sherman-Silver Act, which passed in 1890 and forced the government to buy silver to increase the money supply, and is blamed for the panic. However, even if it was necessary, it played a role in numerous bank runs and bank failures, and only increased the economic hardship of the poor and working class. This led to a populist rage against wealth inequality in the Gilded Age in general, which Cleveland was now the face of. He only increased that rage with how he handled worker strikes, most notably when he sent federal troops to break up a railroad strike known as the Pullman Strike. There was also a major coal miner strike during that time. This populist sentiment split Cleveland's party and wrecked it electorally as the Democrats lost 110 seats in the 1894 midterms. 2 years later, Republican William McKinley won the presidency, ushering in the fifth party system and a Republican trifecta, where one party controls the House, Senate, and presidency, for 16 years. While history has rehabilitated Cleveland's image to some degree, there's no doubt that his electoral failures, unpopularity upon leaving office, and state of the economy under him during that time made for a miserable second term. Number 5. Harry Truman. Rising to the presidency on the death of America's most significant and beloved political figure of the 20th century, Franklin Roosevelt, Truman took office with America in the midst of the deadliest global conflict in human history, World War II. After winning the war, Truman shocked Thomas Dewey to win re-election in 1948 with his aggressive populist campaigning and his significant support for labor and civil rights. However, the issues that made him an underdog in that election only got worse in his second term. There was dramatic inflation after the war thanks to the removal of price controls, and even though it wasn't as bad as Truman's first term, the cumulative effect made life really hard for Americans. Also,
recessions tend to happen in the onset of the end of a war. So that happens. And the inflation was kind of a big problem throughout all of Truman's term. And when he leaves, it's very similar to when Biden leaves, where the economy is basically thriving, but there's pretty rampant inflation, and he leaves very unpopular, despite the fact that he did as good of a job as he could have. You know, he integrates the army. He tries to take over during a steel strike, or it was steel or a railroad strike, and basically the Supreme Court says he couldn't do it. But he was doing everything he could to kind of help everyone. He was someone who didn't really want to be the president because he knew when they picked him that FDR was likely to die, and he was very aware that people aren't going to like someone who ascends to the presidency by accident, but he was also an incredibly prepared person. Much like Jimmy Carter later, he was someone that when he was on the Senate, and he was in the Senate, he had a committee in the Senate, he would read everything. Like, if he was going to be voting on a bill about, railroads, he would read everything in the Library of Congress about trains and railroads. One of the true statesmen that we've had as president.
American troops returning home faced a massive housing shortage during this time, largely because of the fact that wartime efforts halted development, and before that was the Great Depression, where there was no money for development. Truman's own Cold War policy, known as the Truman...
And you got to keep in mind, so many people go into the war when they're like 15, 16 years old. So now they're coming out into their early 20s, and they're, not really living with their parents anymore. They got to have somewhere to go. That's when you have things like Levittown start popping up. Things like the GI Bill start coming up.
Doctrine also suffered a real setback in his second term. His philosophy of supporting efforts across the globe to resist communist influence led to U.S. involvement in the Korean War. Because the war ended in a stalemate, many Americans saw it as a waste of lives and resources. On the other end, beloved War General Douglas MacArthur criticized Truman for not being aggressive enough in the war, so Truman fired him, which backfired politically since MacArthur was such a popular figure for efforts during World War II.
He was also being very publicly critical of the president. When you're someone who works for the president and it's a political job, you have to understand that might happen. But it backfired on Truman because like 70% of the population loved MacArthur at that point. He was as beloved as Eisenhower would become.
Truman was so unpopular that he decided not to seek his party's nomination for another term in 1952.
And he was the last president who could have, because the 24th or 6th Amendment, one of them had passed, limiting the president to 2 terms, but it was retroactive after Harry Truman because he was the sitting president when it passed, so it didn't apply to him.
The ensuing result was Republican Dwight Eisenhower beating Adlai Stevenson in a landslide in the presidential election that year, and the Republicans taking back both the House and the Senate, giving them a trifecta for the first time in 20 years. On the day he left office, Truman's approval rating was 32%, which remains the lowest on record for any outgoing president who completed his term.
And the lowest ever was 29%, which belongs to Truman.
Number 4, Richard Nixon. Re-elected by the largest electoral landslide in U.S. history in 1972 over George McGovern, Nixon carried all but one state and Washington, D.C. He became the first Republican to sweep the South and seemed poised to usher in a new era of politics. Then came disaster. The Yom Kippur War broke out in 1973, in which a coalition of Arab nations, led by Egypt and Syria, attacked U.S. ally Israel in an attempt to reclaim land lost during the Six-Day War in 1967. The U.S.'s support for Israel led to a huge oil crisis at home, as the Arab nations in OPEC imposed an oil embargo against them in retaliation.
And this leads to the inflation and stagflation and oil crises that you see run through Nixon's term and through Ford's term and even into Carter's, that Carter a lot of times takes the blame for. And then it's Carter who you see at the Camp David Accords that gets Egypt and Israel to make peace, and that's when Israel finally gives back all that land that they had conquered in the top of northern Egypt. And that just shows how deep these conflicts in the Middle East run into, and how long these wars can go on, because this is 1973 and the Camp David Accords sometime 4 or 5 years later.
That was just on the policy front. Scandal was the real story of Nixon's second term. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned in 1973 due to criminal charges related to bribery and extortion from his time as governor of Maryland. But of course, the biggest story was Watergate. Nixon's administration used numerous illegal means to cover up a break-in at Democratic headquarters in the Watergate Hotel in 1972, and as the walls closed in on him, he became the first president ever to resign from office in 1974, which he did to avoid impeachment.
And it's crazy. I think this is the 26th Amendment, which officially sets up the presidential succession, and that, establishes, kind of what happens, you have replacing a vice president and all that, where you see Agnew resign, Ford takes over for Agnew, and then like 90 days later, Nixon resigns, Ford takes over for him, and then Rockefeller becomes the vice president. And this is the first time you have a president and vice president in charge of the country where neither of them were elected federally, because Ford was the Speaker of the House at that point, and Rockefeller had just been, I think, governor of New York.
The scandal itself honestly pales in comparison to that of many other presidents, but it ended his presidency, and being forced to leave due to scandal makes for a really bad term. Nixon's party took a huge hit, losing 49 seats in the House in 1974 and 4 in the Senate, giving the Democrats a filibuster-proof majority, and he left office with a 22% approval rating, the lowest of any outgoing president on record.
That filibuster-proof majority held even when Carter was president. He still had that 61-seat majority in 1976.
Number 3, George W. Bush. The first sitting president in 40 years to be re-elected while his party increased its majorities in both chambers of Congress, and the first Republican to do so in 80 years, George W. Bush proclaimed a mandate after he beat John Kerry in the 2004 presidential election. Then came a series of events that made him wildly unpopular and checks all three boxes of our criteria in a negative way. It all started with a major legislative defeat in early 2005 when he attempted to partially privatize Social Security. Bush failed to get it through Congress, and the backlash from senior citizens was so severe that it pushed his approval rating below 50% by May. Later that year,
and that's crazy because his approval rating was 90% after 9/11.
Hurricane Katrina became the worst natural disaster in American history. FEMA's seemingly lack of coordinated response and the National Guard taking 3 days to be called in, despite thousands of people trapped in the city with no food or water, was a major stain on Bush's image. He only made it worse with his optics, which included not returning to Washington from his vacation in Texas until 2 days after the storm hit, telling the FEMA director that he was doing a heck of a job, and doing a photo op in Air Force One of him surveying the damage in the city amidst the horrifying images of what everybody saw down below. Less than a month after Katrina, Bush also failed to push through the nomination of Harriet Miers to the Supreme Court. Miers was perceived to lack experience and appeared to be a more partisan hire than usual since she had worked in the Bush White House. She withdrew her nomination at the end of October.
Imagine something like that now. Wouldn't matter. They'd still get through. You also got to keep in mind all the other horrible legislation Bush had passed. No Child Left Behind, the Patriot Act, Postal Service Accountability and Reform Act. Just destroying the government left and right. One of the worst presidents of all time. A phenomenal and nice human being, but just a horrible president. In his second term, I would probably put as the worst of all time.
Bush's presidency only got worse in 2006 as the public dramatically turned against the Iraq War. The lack of weapons of mass destruction found, increased sectarian violence in the region, and daily stories of dead American soldiers with no end to this war in sight led many to sour on what was happening. And after uniting behind Bush to fight al-Qaeda in his first term in response to 9/11, many grew angry that the organization now seemed stronger and he still hadn't caught Osama bin Laden. As more people learned Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, anti-war sentiment only grew. Scandal also plagued the administration's second term, as the vice president's chief of staff was convicted on obstruction of justice for his role in the outing of CIA agent Valerie Plame. Bush commuting his sentence only made him look worse. Also, the firing of 8 U.S. attorneys in 2007 sparked numerous investigations, and there were high-profile resignations from the administration, including Karl Rove and Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld. Then came the Great Recession. The collapse of the subprime mortgage crisis led to millions of home foreclosures and triggered the 2008 financial crisis, the worst economic crash since the Great Depression. Fair or not, Bush took the brunt of the blame, and his decision to bail out the banks and the auto industry, while approved by Congress and maybe have been necessary to prevent a depression, made him the face of what everybody hated about crony capitalism. Bush left office with his approval more underwater than any outgoing president who completed his term on record to that point. Nixon was more underwater when he left office, but he didn't complete his term, and technically while Truman had a lower approval rating by 2 points, Bush's disapproval rating was 5 points higher than Truman's. His unpopularity did severe damage to his party too, as they lost the House and the Senate in the 2006 midterms after holding it for 12 years, and in 2008, they lost the White House to Barack Obama, who became the first black president and won with the largest margin of victory for any president of the 21st century. Or as Chris Rock so eloquently put it,
Bush up so bad, he made it hard for the white man to run for president.
And indeed, it was that bad. Although Obama ran against John McCain, a war hero who seemed like the perfect candidate, Obama focused exclusively on attacking Bush's policies, and the heart of his attacks on McCain were simply McCain being too similar to Bush, since they were in the same party. This was a real attack ad from that time.
I am not President Bush. True, but you did vote with Bush 90% of the time.
Early in Obama's presidency,
McCain was a sacrificial lamb. There was no way in hell he was winning that election. The Democrats could have put forward a broomstick with a wig on, and they would have beat McCain.
He and the Democrats had a filibuster-proof Senate with 60 seats and the largest majority in Congress for either party in 30 years, all due to the backlash against Bush. Number 2, William McKinley. Again, he was assassinated.
Another cheeky lame entrance.
He had no second-term accomplishments to go with his assassination. No other explanation needed. Before we get to number 1, I want to
Lazy and
address a couple
stupid.
presidents who did not make this list. Since Nixon was on here, many might ask why Bill Clinton wasn't, as he was impeached his second term. The Monica Lewinsky affair is certainly a scandal, and given the fact that it led to him getting caught cheating on his wife, it's probably a personal situation he didn't want either. However, Clinton's approval remained high throughout his second term, actually peaking at 71% the day he was impeached.
Left in 60.
Scandal also, the Democrats picked up seats in the 1998 midterms, and Clinton remains the only president since Reconstruction whose party did that. That, combined with legislative successes like the Children's National Health Insurance Program, kept him off this list. Also, Barack Obama certainly had a rough second term with the IRS targeting scandal, the Edward Snowden leaks, and the bungled rollout of the Affordable Care Act. His party got wiped out in the 2014 midterms and ended with Donald Trump winning the 2016 election while Republicans held the House and the Senate. Failure to pass gun control, immigration reform, and nominate a Supreme Court justice after Antonin Scalia's death also hurt him. However, his own approval never bottomed out, and he left office well above 50% in popularity, and his party did pick up seats in the 2016 elections in the House and the Senate, despite a Republican trifecta. So it just wasn't enough for him to be on here. And the number 1 worst second term in history, Woodrow Wilson. Narrowly re-elected in 1916, Woodrow Wilson won on the promise of keeping America out of World War I and as a reward for remaining neutral in the war to that point.
And immediately got us involved in World War I when he got reelected.
He kept us out of war was the campaign slogan. Barely a month after his second inauguration, Wilson broke that promise. The pretext for involving the U.S. in World War I was a series of German attacks on civilian ships, including American merchant ships in the war zone.
On clipper boats?
Got the U.S. involved on the side of the Allies against the Germans. He instituted a draft in May of 1917. The backlash was immediate thanks to the isolationist instinct of Americans and the large number of people of German descent in the country. Wilson responded to the backlash with the Espionage and Sedition Acts, allowing him to jail opponents of the draft and the war, such as Eugene V. Debs.
Second coming of John Adams.
Was upheld by the Supreme Court at that time, but it certainly decreased his popularity. After the war ended in 1918, Wilson seemingly had success with his role in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 and the establishment of the League of Nations in 1920.
Which the United States didn't join.
But he failed to get his own country to join the League of Nations. So that became a major failure. Then there was the Spanish flu outbreak, which began in the spring of 1918, and the combination of the flu and World War I reduced life expectancy in the U.S. by nearly 12 years. There was also the major post-war economic recession in 1920 that lasted through the end of Wilson's presidency.
Follows most wars.
Electorally speaking, Republicans picked up 24 seats in the House and took back control of the Senate by picking up 5 seats in 1918. They added 10 more seats in the Senate to get to 59 and 64 seats in the House to hold over 300 in 1920. Republican presidential candidate Warren G. Harding won in a landslide in 1920 with over 400 electoral votes against James B. Cox. Harding exclusively campaigned against Wilson's policies, barely even mentioning Cox, and began a period of 12 straight years with a Republican trifecta. Wilson's second term was so bad that it brought a sharp end to the progressive era too, as Harding campaigned on a platform of return to normalcy, which signified a return to the laissez-faire economics of the Gilded Age and ushered in the Roaring Twenties. Oh, and on a personal level, Wilson suffered a horrible stroke in 1919.
Most deserved in history.
Secret from the public. His wife Edith handled many of the presidential duties for the rest of his term after that. Thanks for hopping into the history buff.
So, other than the stupid assassination entries, a pretty good list. These, I don't know what the deal is with these animations right here, but they're weird. I don't even know how to describe how low rent they are. But overall, pretty good list. Who would you put as the most unsuccessful second-term president? Do you agree with his list? Do you agree with my interpretations of his list? Let me know down below. If you enjoyed this kind of thing, remember to like, share, and subscribe. And remember, never stop learning.